Hello, everyone. Welcome. So welcome to our MOOC this evening. So it's going to be on coding for the climate crisis. So this MOOC is a great intro to our hackathon sponsored by Beazley. We'll be first hearing from Nicole about tech that can help us reduce our carbon footprint. Later, we'll be hearing from Brad from Beazley about why they're sponsoring the hackathon and some insight into their teams. So backstage, you have me, Aileen. I am a Code for Girls brand ambassador. So if you have any questions about Code for Girls or other upcoming classes and events, please do put them in the YouTube chat and I'll reply you during the session. So I currently work as a delivery manager for a challenger bank. I studied and worked as a chemical engineer before pivoting back to fintech after 3.5 years in energy. I've worked with Code for Girls during university and joined their courses during the first lockdown, which helped me switch careers into tech. So I'm just going to add Nicole onto the stream, whom we'll say hello to. Hi, Nicole. Good to see you.
Hi. Thanks. Nice to meet you.
No problem. Nice to have you join us. So Nicole is a senior product manager at EmmitWise. EmmitWise is a climate tech startup that enables companies to measure, report, and reduce their carbon emissions. Prior to joining EmmitWise, she was a senior product manager for South Pole's innovation team building similar software. She then started her career in technology with Code for Girls while at St. Andrews and went on to co-found 2 companies, Advance, an AI-driven graduate career marketplace, and She Can Code, which enables companies to attract, hire, and retain more women in technology. She completed a part-time full-stack engineering course with Flatiron School to bridge her own technical gap, and in her own words is living her dream, doing not only a job she loves, product management, but in a domain that she understands and deeply cares about. So we're really excited to have you, Nicole, here today, and we're really happy to help, to have you kick off. So whenever you're ready, I can add the screen. Excellent. I'm adding your presentation to it. And yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you to Code for Girls for hosting me. It's great to be sort of back in the community of sort of where my journey in tech started. And then a huge shout out to Lorna, who's one of the very senior people at EmmitWise, who's been very influential in sort of getting this up and going and making sure that we at EmmitWise are driving diversity and helping and inspiring young women to get into technology. And then, of course, thank you to Beazley for sponsoring and hosting the session. So I'll get started. So let me just quickly navigate to that. Okay, so we're going to talk about coding for the climate crisis. So I think let's talk about as we stand today. So what is the elephant in the room? Here we can see that humanity has caused climate change. So since 1850, our planet has been warming at an unprecedented rate, which hasn't been seen in the last 2,000 years. And this timeline kind of coincides with the Industrial Revolution. If you're confused about the Industrial Revolutions, you might be surprised, like I was, to learn that we're already in our 4th revolution. So while the world may look very different to the Victorian one from the Industrial Revolution, it's still kind of driven by the same economic motives and, most importantly, the same natural resources, just on a much more significant scale than it was then. So what are the 3 key findings from the 6th IPCC report? So the IPCC is the Intragovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the chances are that you probably haven't read the 4,000-page report. So I'll just run you through some of the key learnings. The first one is that we have already hit the sort of 1.2 degree of temperature rise. The world is warming. And so in 2015, the Paris Agreement made an international priority to keep temperature rises below 1.5 degrees by 2050. Every degree above this has a detrimental effect on the planet. And we can't just blame it on the planet going through its natural phases and so on, and solar activity and everything. That only these sort of solar activity and volcanic eruptions only heated the world 0.05 degrees since 1900. So it has been the human involvement and our actions that's caused this massive rise. So point 2, if nearly half of our emissions of the next 8 years if we nearly half of all of our emissions in the next 8 years, there's a potential to keep climate change to a minimum. But let's just be realistic for a minute. In 2022, the world came to a standstill with COVID, no flights, minimal car usage, low consumption, but emissions only dropped 7%. So when we say we need drastic action, we really, really mean it. Then the third point that's really important to point out that came out of this report is that the IPCC mapped out various scenarios alongside their 14,000 strong cohort of researchers. The most extreme scenario was a 4-degree warming by 2050. And bear in mind, we're sort of striving for 1.5, which is not far off 4. And this scenario will happen if we don't curb fossil fuel usage. So the adverse effects of this temperature will have a significant increase in the number of extreme weather episodes that we witness, which I'm sure a lot of us have seen in sort of the most recent of times. But there is hope. So I am a climate optimist. And the IPCC report was like sort of rejuvenating in that sense, with such a big global issue, on the table affecting companies, countries, and every individual. There is a reason for us to change. And with women like us who really want to use our talents for climate change, or some of us perhaps, I think that there is a lot to be optimistic about. The IPCC isn't only a wake-up call. It's also stated that 68% of global GDP is covered by net zero commitments, which means that 59 countries have committed to net zero. And with COP26 coming up in Glasgow, I think it's in November, climate change has really seen and sort of been in the spotlight. Just from my personal experience, I can't explain how in the last year, it's just been at the top of every news report. It's been everywhere. So everyone is starting to sort of take action and understand that climate change is real, it is happening, and that's really positive. So what is technology's role in this? So there's been like a lot of different estimations on what technology's ability is to fight future climate change. The most ambitious is IPCC's calculations that technology can reduce global emissions by 2/3. So this is where we're sort of splitting technology into two, hardware and software. Today, we're really going to talk about software because that's sort of the work that we're doing at EmitWise. But I will quickly say that there are an incredible amount of innovations taking place in terms of carbon sequestration, sensors for agriculture, and alternative energy resources, just to name a few. So we're going to focus on software. So what is technology's role to play? So over the last 10 years, there's been a real boom in climate tech, green tech, carbon tech, whatever you want to call it. New companies have sprung up, providing different software solutions that fix real-world problems in a variety of disciplines. So their customers have been large enterprise companies who are looking for tech solutions to decarbonize their sort of risk and to de-risk their different scenarios, which could mean that their business could completely change, not just their customer base, but different where they get their resources from, all of that. So here are some of the sort of things that are affecting and playing a role in that. What we're going to talk about now is like 3 different core technologies, and these 3 core technologies, they all have something in common. So we'll think of this as like a sliding scale. The most common is probably machine learning, which you would have obviously read about, but and the intention of it developing into AI in the future. And secondly, blockchain, although its climate purposes are just sort of starting to be realized. And then finally, we're going to talk about quantum computing, which is the new kid on the block, and its potential is still being explored. So let's have a look at them in a little more detail. So AI, what does AI offer? So machine learning's ability to learn from experiences and data sets in turn enables better decision-making processes across organizations and governments. So it also acts as a precursor for artificial intelligence, which goes a few steps further in terms of injecting human reasoning and logic into decision-making. It's not just statistical techniques. So machine learning is at the heart of many climate tech startups, and it is sort of their unique selling point, if I will say. This is because only one thing is holding back climate change, and that's a lack of data and understanding where it actually exists and what to do with that data. And as the age-old adage states, you can't manage what you can't measure. So looking further into AI, it also has sort of exponential powers in terms of other technology and hardware like satellites. If we think about its ability to interpret data in any format, from spreadsheets to videos to any sort of data, and contextualize it, then it sort of makes the perfect partner. And that's why there's really high hopes about AI and satellite technology together providing real-time understandings of the Earth's resources and availability and our environmental systems. So we can model sustainability and biodiversity strategies and plot different sort of farming solutions to keep track of adverse climate action across different farming and deforestation. So I think that's something that's really interesting and that we should reflect on, is that satellites have the ability to sort of measure how much carbon is in the air and then model that to try and understand, is it going up and is it going down? So PwC research indicated that if AI were to replace business as usual practices as we see today, that the world economy would be boosted by $5.2 trillion by 2030, while also reducing emissions by 4%. So that's the 4% of emissions is the equivalent of Japan, Australia, and Canada's emissions together. So let's look at like a case study for AI. So of course, Emitwise does carbon accounting, so I'm a little biased on this one, but it's a fun fact that I actually love. 70% of global emissions are caused by only 100 companies. And that's something that always blows my mind. So it's not really surprising that loads of different companies are trying to set net zero pledges for 20, 30, 40, or 50. And the problem that they're experiencing is, how do they achieve this? How do they get there? So where it really starts is trying to understand the baseline of your emissions across the entire value chain, from your raw materials to how your end user or your customer actually disposes of a product at the end of its life. And in fact, 98% of a company's emissions can live within its upstream and downstream value chain, which means it's not actually them producing it, it's the way that it gets transported, consumed, and treated at the end of its life. So that's something that's really interesting. So even though it's these 100 companies that might be causing 70% of the emissions, it's actually how we're interacting and purchasing and consuming those products that's also having an effect on that number. So we can't just say, I shouldn't do anything. So it's not so easy nor surprising that less than a third of companies who publicly disclose their carbon footprint exhaustively measure their emissions across their value chain. And many companies stick to sort of understanding or trying to measure the things that they have ownership over, which is what we call like scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that's because those are the things that they typically have access to data for. So this will be like their buildings, their truck fleets, their electricity providers. It's the fuel that they burn on site, rather than how it gets transported, consumed, and treated at the end of its life. And that's the real challenge, because companies are finding it very difficult to trace sort of the product life cycle of something after they've released it into a market. And that's why it becomes incredibly complex to try and understand the whole stream of your emissions. And that's where machine learning can really help. So instead of manually collecting data in sort of Excel spreadsheets and PDF invoices and napkin sort of back of the envelope, meter readings, companies can actually start to centralize data really quickly and continuously from far and wide using machine learning. What it actually does is it feeds off this data, and every different measurement that we do adds to the system learning, and that improves in accuracy over time. So the increased speed of data ingestion and understanding enables companies to get a close to real-time view of their emissions and their carbon footprint. This means that they can set and track carbon reduction initiatives, and it's actually possible for them to understand throughout the year rather than just once a year what is affecting their emissions. Has it gone up? Has it gone down? Where can we sort of pinpoint hotspots to make reductions? So AI is likely going to be incorporated in the coming years to help with insights and how we can reduce emissions. It'll do so through scenario modeling and looking at different risk indications, trying to spot anomalies, for example, data that's missing or inaccurate, and then using that data to synthesize and try and model or understand how is it progressing? How can we understand what this might look like at the current trajectory, or if we were to make a change? And that makes AI a really useful tool when we come to trying to help a company to understand and manage their carbon footprint. So the second topic that we're going to talk about is blockchain. So the significant benefit of blockchain is its ability to be a decentralized ledger of activities. So it transparently shares transactions from start to finish. You might have first heard about it with like the rise of Bitcoin, but blockchain also has the power to fight climate change, particularly when it comes to corporate supply chains and currency markets. Questions that I get from customers of ours are, how can we track sort of, when we make purchases of raw materials, then it moves through our value chain, and they're trying to understand, how does it move through our value chain? Where does it get transported to from one facility to the next until it reaches the consumer? And tracking that is really cumbersome and time consuming, which makes it expensive. And that's why companies tend to be sort of opposed to understanding what their emissions are, because of how cumbersome that process is. But because blockchain is a sort of undisputed ledger of goods and services and where they've moved to and from, it could be very valuable as an application to solve climate change. So PwC noted over 65 different ways that blockchain could be used to fight climate change. This included revolutionizing access to capital from new investors. And that's really helpful, because considering the $4 trillion that we need per annum to reach net zero, there's a lot of money in the market to essentially try and figure out, how can we revolutionize access to capital and change that so that it gets funneled into doing good for the world rather than, pushing us further away. So if we look at a case study for blockchain, I think what's most important about it is its transparency, and this is what makes it really attractive. So we've probably all fallen victim to like greenwashing, like hearing about companies in the news that have purchased carbon credits from shady projects and have made promises that sort of gloss over the truth of climate action. But in its very nature, because blockchain assimilates the supply chain and each block adds to one another, it leaves such unique footprint information for all of us to see and interrogate. And by tracking each of these steps, we have this immutable sort of record of provenance. It's kind of like when you're selling art to try and establish whether that art is real or not. Was it painted? Is it a fake or not? You need provenance to understand that. And that's the opportunity that blockchain provides us at scale, to be able to establish provenance amongst different products in a company's supply chain. So enabling companies to make better purchasing decisions for the climate requires that you need some sort of ledger like this. And this leads to increased efficiencies across their supply chain when holding companies and suppliers to account for their footprint. So they're actually able to then point things out and say, well, I dispute this because they can see. So again, it comes down to knowing what you're measuring. And this plays back into the idea of circularity. So one's waste becomes another person's gold. So blockchain can really help to identify where waste is created and where we can generate value from it. And that's a really interesting thought. So the third point that we're going to go over is quantum computing. So it's the third application of technology or software where we think it can make a huge impact. And quantum computing, as you may know, doesn't work through sequential yes or no decisions. So it actually utilizes a distributed probability sequence, and the ability of it to test and retest surpasses like what any other computer can do today. So for example, modeling something like carbon molecules to find ways to capture and remove it from our atmosphere would take a normal computer 50,000 years to figure out. But with quantum computing, we could potentially do that in one day. So NASDAQ research indicated that quantum computing could make good business sense and potentially generate 450 billion annually in cost savings and revenue, which would also incentivize investment into quantum computing. So that's one that I'm really excited about. And it's in terms of its case study, I just want to check there. So quantum computing provides a world of different possibilities. And if we look at one example that was raised by BCG, Google, Microsoft, it's fertilizer. It doesn't sound very sexy, but fertilizer is essential to agriculture and it's part of the majority of the food we eat. It's huge business. So it's also a huge consumer of natural gas and a very significant emitter. It actually produces more emissions annually than the whole of the UK. So the process of creating fertilizer was designed by Haber Bosch over 100 years ago, and it actually hasn't changed much since then. So what we were sort of thinking about was how can quantum computing find an alternative catalyst for the process? It can find something that sort of mimics the way that ammonia is produced in nature, but by bacteria. And what this could have the potential to do is lower the production emissions and make the process far more cost effective, which reduces costs for farmers and therefore food, and then it sort of rolls down the supply chain. And it may also minimize the damage that is done to the soil from chemically fueled fertilizers and water systems that they run off into. So I'm moving fast, but there's quite a lot to get through. So let's look sort of at like the problem with technology and the roadblocks that lay ahead. So if technology does have the potential to make such an incredible difference, what is the holdup? And when we think about the holdup, it comes down to three things. So innovation is incredibly expensive and expansive. There are so many different technologies available. It can be really hard to hedge your bets on the right one to invest in. So the World Economic Forum reported earlier this year that there is a commitment of $70 trillion in capital to help support this transition. But there is still a deal level risk of backing the wrong horse or investing in the wrong technologies or two new technologies for that to even be realized. So what we think is that we probably need to find better ways of evidencing the potential and stimulating future impact. And what I mean by that is sort of increasing trust within our investment communities. Investors generally want like a 10-to-1 return. So they tend to kind of like place really small bets, and then they really want to see progress super fast before they're willing to take like a risk. And there's a lot of different people making these bets and a lot of different people working on the same problem set. So with time running out, we think that we should sort of encourage investors to bite the bullet and invest in many, test, iterate quickly, reinvest, divest, and sort of play around until they find something that sticks and something that's showing evidence of working. Otherwise, you sort of start investing in these things that are like too big to fail and aren't really actually producing any results. So another roadblock for technology is that energy consumption. So technology does wonders for climate change, but it also causes it. So I'm sure you've heard about, how much energy it takes to sort of cool, systems. So currently, the tech sector alone is responsible for 3% of global greenhouse emissions, which is actually quite a lot. And as the use of technology increases, so does the energy cost. So, for example, Cornell found that a deep learning algorithm produces 283 metric tons of CO2. So what is 283 metric tons of CO2? That's 5 times the average American's car emissions annually. So that's just one algorithm. So if you think of how many different algorithms, we're trying to produce to solve this problem, we're actually creating another problem as we do that. So how can we reduce that? I think one way we can do that is switching to cloud-based activities, which is quite helpful. But we also have to find cheaper ways of training AI that are less energy and resource intensive. And where the majority of that is learned is helpful at the task at hand, therefore more energy efficient. The third problem is one that I think is probably closest to home for all of us, and that's in the talent pool. So a lot of this tech is fundamentally new, which means that it's not actually taught regularly at schools, universities, or companies. And I'm sure a lot of you can kind of empathize with the fact that we may not have had exposure to technology when we were little, and the rate at which it's changing is making it ever more difficult for us to keep up with that pace of change and to access that education. So talent pools are definitely limited right now. There's not enough really capable, smart, and willing people that are engaging in the use of technology to solve climate change. And I think that's why you're also important today. So let's look at what we can actually do. So whether you work in climate tech or not, here are a few things that you can sort of do to minimize carbon footprint of the companies you work with. So the energy efficiency of your website. Question whether design needs all of those big, beautiful images or lighter imagery would do the job. And in doing so, lessen the environmental impact of every click on your site. Switch to cloud and data centers instead of personal servers, because just doing that would save 629 million metric tons of CO2 in the next 3 years. And you get extra points for switching your data center to run on renewable energy. So some codes are more efficient than others, which might be super interesting. So the latest poll stated that C, Rust, C++, Ada, and Java are the lightest codes when it comes, leave the lightest footprints when it comes to coding. So that's quite interesting, I think. Let me just skip into the last one. So yeah, so how I got into climate tech, they sort of explained a little bit about it earlier, but my journey sort of started with Co-First Girls, and after founding 2 companies, I've always felt that I needed to do something that's like super socially responsible, and I grew up in South Africa, near or on a farm, and so we always had like solar powered energy, and it was something that was very important for my parents to make sure that we weren't leaving big footprints. And so obviously sort of meshing my love for technology and my love for the environment and seeing the need that we have for climate change and solving the climate crisis, that could sort of had me stumble into it. I think if you sort of know what you love, things will find a way to work out. So my first job in climate tech was at South Pole, and since then it's ventured into Emitwise. But it's been a really, really eye-opening and enlightening experience, not just because before I started in climate tech, I didn't understand my own footprint, but now that I'm building carbon emissions calculators, it's crazy to try and make sense of, or to really understand like what makes a difference. It's really interesting to see that some things that we think are really impactful, like not using plastic straws, actually have such a minor impact compared to taking a flight, for example. So I would really encourage everyone to seek out to measure your own footprint and try and understand what the impact of every decision that you're making has on our climate, and then to find yourself in a career or, work for something that is going to help you to sort of make an impact in the world, if that is something that you obviously want to do. So that's it for me. And now I'll switch to questions.
Thanks, Nicole. That was really, really good. We do have a few questions before we invite Brad onto the stage. So what are the gaps do you see in the work towards fighting climate change?
Yeah, so I suppose some of the gaps that I see in fighting climate change, I guess it definitely comes back to what I was saying in terms of like knowing what your emissions are. I think that the biggest gap is that people aren't really measuring, and so they don't really understand the consequence of each of their decisions. I think beyond what I mentioned in the talk about like there's certainly being like a talent pool gap, like not enough people being skilled or going into climate change as a sector. There's a huge demand for it, and there's a lot of like companies popping up, and a lot of people who want smart people to work on those problems. But beyond the talent pool gap, I think it just starts with yourself and like just generally people not actually knowing what their emissions are, and so like not actually knowing how to even begin to solve it and where it's going to make the most impact. That's what we sort of spend a lot of time helping our companies do, is try to say, well, if you're going to do something, let's try and pinpoint the lowest effort, highest value change that you can make to your system, so that we don't waste time implementing things that aren't actually going to be impactful.
Okay, great, thank you. And as this is a sort of intro to the hackathon, the Code First Girls hackathon coming up, where should participants go for inspiration for the hackathon?
Sure. So I think my biggest source of inspiration is I listened to a podcast called My Climate Journey. So I guess you could probably find it on all channels. I listen to it on Spotify. But what it is, it's a retired software engineer who sort of got really burnt out, and he's now on a quest to fight the climate crisis. And how he's doing that is he's interviewing different founders of climate tech startups, and also more established companies and researchers and all sorts of people, to try and collate all of this information and ask them really tough questions. And it's a really interesting sort of wealth of knowledge and really easy listening.
That's great. And we've got one final question from Anna. So what is a hard skill that you see is lacking in climate tech?
A hard skill. So I guess a hard skill is what I'll try and define first, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm thinking a hard skill is probably like a technical skill. And I think the hardest skill is probably having domain expertise on like what climate what climate change is. So that was a hard skill. I think you certainly have like technical skills like software engineering or product management or whatever that could be useful, but I don't actually think that's the biggest thing that's stopping us from tackling climate change, because it's so transferable from other industries. So the hardest skill for me was understanding greenhouse gas accounting, which is like trying to make sense of how do we calculate someone's emissions? Like how does that happen? And it's, once you start to demystify it, you realize it's not that complex. But I think so few people sort of venture down that journey to try and make sense of it. And I would say like there is I can recommend looking up the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a good place to start, for example, to try and read through their chapters of like what are different emissions and like how would you go about calculating them, because anything you do within the climate crisis all comes down to measurement first before you can go further down the funnel.
Great, thanks so much, Anne. Thanks so much, Anna, for asking that question, and Nicole for answering that. So I'm just going to invite Brad onto the stream. So Brad is the head of technology at Beazley. Brad is passionate about building high-performing tech teams that deliver change. Brad is also committed to building an inclusive and diverse technology team and is doing so through partnerships such as the one with us, Code for Girls. Outside of work, Brad is a dad to 2 girls, Matilda and Nina, aged 6 and 4, who may likely make an appearance tonight on the MOOC, so we'll very much welcome them. So Brad, welcome. Nice to see you. Do you want to go into a little bit more about what Beazley is and why is Beazley sponsoring the hackathon?
Yes, no, thank you. So it's great to be here. As you mentioned, Brad O'Connor, head of technology at Beazley, and I'm looking after the 2 girls at the moment. They're downstairs quietly watching TV in their pajamas, but they may burst into the room at any given point. So apologies if they do. I've said they can come and say hi if they do. So just for those who don't know, Beazley are a sort of specialist insurance company. Now, I don't think anyone would probably have heard of Beazley prior to our partnership with Code First Girls, which is another great reason why we've partnered with Code First Girls. But just to kind of bring to life Beazley a little bit, and hopefully like a couple of examples that will resonate with everyone on this call. So Beazley sponsored the Tokyo Olympics, obviously, which happened this year, but was due to take place last year. So we do event cancellation insurance. So if the event gets cancelled or postponed, then a claim will be made. And because of the Olympics was postponed a year, and obviously it was sort of taken place behind closed doors, we had to pay kind of millions of pounds in compensation because they couldn't obviously attract the most revenues from all the kind of ticket sales. So that's one example. Another example, which I think should resonate with this audience, we're very big in cyber insurance. So we're one of the leading cyber insurance insurers, and what that means is we kind of insure clients against sort of ransomware attacks. We've seen in the last 18 months there's a big increase in ransomware attacks. The kind of these gangs that are doing these attacks are getting very sophisticated. So we offer insurance if kind of an incident happens. But what gives us our kind of competitive advantage at the moment is we offer preventative measures as well as post services. So we work with our clients to kind of give them advice on how to reduce the risk of them actually being kind of suffering a ransomware attack. And if something does happen, we also provide services to help them recover their kind of infrastructure, recover some of their data, etc. So that's a little bit about kind of Beazley. As Aileen mentioned, Beazley are committed to kind of being a responsible business. We've just released our new Beazley strategy, and one of the pillars is responsible business. One of our core Beazley brands is brand values is doing the right thing above all else, which helps guide our decision making. So one aspect of being a responsible business is obviously our efforts in inclusivity and diversity, and obviously our partnership with Code First Girls is helping us really drive the gender diversity within the team. And another extremely important aspect of our kind of being a responsible business, obviously the environment and the planet, which is why we're so excited about this kind of hackathon, and really excited over the next month to work with a bunch of teams in supporting our kind of hackathon challenge. So I guess I kind of pause there and ask any kind of questions.
Yeah, sounds great. So I think a question on most of the participants' mind is, what would Beazley like to see from this hackathon? Like, not a shopping list, but what are you guys hoping to get out of this?
So I think one, obviously, we're looking to just for everyone to enjoy the experience. I think whilst everyone's going to be formed into kind of teams and there's going to be a winner at the end of it, but I think don't see it as kind of competing necessarily against each other. I would sort of see it as collaborating with your team. So I think what we want to get at it really is everyone kind of having a good time, everyone meeting kind of new contacts. We've got about 23, 24 mentors that we've signed up through Beazley. We had a call today at lunchtime just to kind of prep people because there were people a bit nervous as to what to expect. But we've had a really good kind of response from people really wanting to be a mentor. So I think really enjoy the kind of the process, get a lot out of it. It's not necessarily about the winning or the end result. It's about what you learn through the process. But I think what we're looking for really is some unique ideas. It doesn't necessarily need to be a kind of a brand new kind of leading edge innovation. You may take something that already exists but use it in a different way to solve a different problem. So I always would encourage everyone to think, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What we're talking about here is helping employers like Beazley, helping employees, and empower employees to reduce their carbon footprint. Us as an organization, we've committed to reducing our carbon footprint by 50% in 2023. Now, it was easy this year because no one was flying and international travel wasn't a thing. Now, international travel is kind of back on the cards again. We really need to work really hard at reducing that emission and to make sure we kind of hit those targets. So I think looking at how you can kind of encourage encourage and educate people about their kind of carbon use and carbon footprint. Really, I think Nicole mentioned awareness is one of the first sort of steps. I think I've only started to really sort of get interested in this space in the last 6 to 9 months, and I went on to the I think it was the WWF sort of website and did one of those carbon footprint things. And because of my sort of domestic and international business travel, I was kind of in the red. So I definitely need to work harder to reduce my own carbon footprint. So I'm personally looking, because I'm going to be one of the mentors as well, personally looking forward to learning a little bit more about the subject so I can kind of educate myself as well as members of my family and members and employees of Beazley.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I'll paste the link to that WWF carbon footprint calculator as well. I did that too. Yeah. And a lot of mine, I think I took a trip to Australia last year. So I think that burnt up most of my my carbon footprint. But, the last year with COVID has sort of helped with that. I'm just going to add Nicole back onto the call as well, so we can answer a bit more questions from you both on the various topics. So hi, Nicole, good to see you again. So a question for you both. What is the most exciting thing for you in this space? Nicole, do you want to go first? You're just on mute, Nicole.
There we go. You mean in the climate tech space?
Yes, that's right.
The most interesting or exciting? Yeah,
exciting.
The most exciting. Okay. I think it's been seeing the commitments from different companies and like the actual interest to understand their emissions and also to set science-based targets. I think that's been really exciting. I mean, the growth of that in the last year has been extraordinary, and that's really exciting for people in our sort of business, is to see how engaged people are. Here's a fox.
We have another guest.
Apologies, I think my 6-year-old thought it was funny.
We were warned that we will have 2 special guests tonight, so they're more than welcome to join us whenever they're ready.
No, so yeah, I think it's, to me, it's been seeing the engagement from companies to really start making commitments and setting science-based targets. And I think I'm a huge optimist. I think interestingly, my first sort of venture into technology was also in insurance, and I wrote my dissertation on what the mass penetration of AI would do on or autonomous vehicles would have on the insurance industry, and how that would completely change insurance models. And so I think insurance is really interesting. I think that's really cool. And autonomous vehicles, for example, and different people switching to different energy providers is really interesting for business. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff happening. It's a really cool space to be in.
And what about yourself, Brad?
What's the most
exciting thing? Yeah, for you.
I'm definitely not an expert in the kind of carbon tech space. I'd be a fraud if I said I was. I think we had Chris Illman, our head of responsible business, presenting at the Code Fest a couple of weeks ago. He's obviously our kind of expert in sustainability. I'm a kind of tech expert, but combining the two between us, I think we've got enough sort of expertise to sort of mentor and coach the teams. But for me, I think this is really a topic where everyone's getting interested in now. I think we've got COP26 coming up. I think all of our employees are really interested in this space. I'm doing an MBA at the moment, and one of my assignments I've got to do around an entrepreneurial kind of idea, and so I did a bit of primary research with some of the Beazley members of staff just to understand, whether
I
they
think
kind
we've
of.
lost Brad for the moment, but I'm sure he'll come back to it.
Oh, I
Can you
can
hear
hear
me?
him. I
Can
can
you
hear
hear
him. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, might have been my internet then that might have gone. Hi, Brad. Good to see you.
Right. So I was saying, so I've sort of surveyed some of the team, and it's interesting. A lot of people don't have any awareness of their carbon footprint, but they'd all like to have awareness. And I think just having that conversation about that and providing people with the kind of awareness, the tools, I think that once they start tracking, so I think really data is really kind of key into this. And we were looking at lunchtime, as I said, we had a kickoff with some of our kind of mentors, and we were looking, just doing some Googling and some research live during the lunchtime session. And there's lots of kind of APIs you can integrate into sort of flight systems now. And so when you're booking a flight, you can find out how much emissions that flight would kind of cost. So, we're talking about potentially at Beazley giving people carbon budgets. And not only have they got a pounds and dollar budget for travel and expenses, but they've also got a carbon budget. So, and they have to stick to that. So as a team, if they have a bunch of flights, they have to prioritize, who goes where and what's the most important kind of thing to do. And we can do that with the data and kind of a lot of these sort of open API technologies.
Definitely, yeah.
Really, really cool. And final question for you both. What's the most important thing that you would like our audience to take away from today? So Nicole, do you want to go first? Because Brad just finished, so I'll give him some time to think about it as well.
Yeah, I think I would say, the most important thing I think is about knowing, sort of finding something that you really are interested in or something that intrigues you, and then, being really creative in how you can solve that. And obviously, given that this audience is Code First Girls, I want to encourage you to use technology to solve it, because I do think it has the potential. Using data has the potential to solve things on a much bigger scale. But I think it's more about finding something that you're really passionate about, and then using your skills and creativity to figure out a way you can fix a problem. I think that's one thing that's really, that for me has been like my guiding light through my career, and has led me to being in a position where I love what I do. So I think that's the thing that I think is most important. But obviously, I love hackathons as well. I think, for the hackathon coming up, have fun. Think wildly and think creatively, and check your assumptions and ask people questions and be curious.
That's such a good one. And what about you, Brad?
I think it's really understanding, what's the problem you're trying to solve. So there's a lot of technology out there. I'm sure there's a lot of good solutions, but having real clarity on the problem you're trying to solve and who the kind of customer is, and making sure any kind of solution is usable, because I think people want to do the right thing in terms of understanding carbon emission and reducing it, but I think people are very time poor or lazy. They've got a lot going on, work outside of work. So I think whatever we do, whatever we develop, whatever we sort of provide, we need to think about how easy to use, and how kind of just making people's lives sort of easier and giving people access to data to make kind of informed decisions. And I'd echo Nicole's, it's about having fun. It's not necessarily about winning. I think I read somewhere, sometimes when you try to compete, it sort of stifles kind of creativity and innovation, because you're worried about winning, not necessarily worried about coming up with the most interesting, innovative idea. So I think just have fun, collaborate with your teams. There's lots of information out there on the websites. As I said, we'll probably have at least 2 Beazley mentors per team, someone probably with a bit more technical expertise, someone with a bit more business sort of knowledge. So there'll be a lot of resources available to you and the teams.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time out and joining us this evening. I know it's Friday evening, so you probably have plans. But just want to thank you so much, Nicole and Brad, for answering all the questions. And hopefully that's inspired our audience today as they join the hackathon and produce and create really cool things. So have a good weekend, everybody who's listening, as well as Brad and Nicole. It's so nice to see you guys. I'll see you next time, and I'm gonna end the broadcast.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.